On the far edge of the Andromeda Arm, where starlight grew thin and silence stretched for light years, the orbital station Varel 9 hung in the void like a silver seed. It was a place of truce, built by many hands and watched over by none. Every few cycles, species from across the galaxy gathered here for the Galactic Accord Summit, a meeting meant to keep peace among civilizations that had once tried to burn each other out of existence. This year the station buzzed with more energy than usual. Word had spread that the Karathi, a proud and fearsome reptilian race, would send their warlord himself. The Karathi were hunters by blood and belief. They measured worth in kills, honor in scars, and strength in how many worlds they had bent to their will. To them, diplomacy was just another kind of hunt, one where words replaced claws, but the goal remained the same: to dominate. Inside the main chamber, delegates from over 30 species filled the tiered seats. Some floated in anti-grav pods, others stood on multiple legs, and a few communicated through pulses of colored light. Near the back, almost forgotten, sat 3 humans. They wore plain gray uniforms with no rank, no emblem, no sign of a fleet or a planet behind them. The eldest among them, Frank Dobbs, leaned on a wooden cane carved with small notches, each one marking a year he never thought he'd live to see. At 82, his hair was white as lunar dust, his hands spotted with age, but his eyes held a quiet fire that had seen too much to be easily shaken. Beside him sat his granddaughter Lena, in her late 20s, with sharp eyes and a stillness that spoke of deep thought rather than fear. On his other side was Ray Monroe, a man in his 70s with a calm face and a voice so soft it could calm a storm if he chose to use it. The Karathi entered like a thunderclap. Tall, scaled, and armored in black chitin, they moved with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat. Their leader, Warlord Vexar, stood nearly 9 feet tall, his tail coiled like a spring, his yellow eyes scanning the room with open contempt. When his gaze landed on the humans, he stopped. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, then grew into a full laugh that echoed off the chamber walls. Others joined in, some out of nervous habit, others because mocking the weak was easier than facing their own doubts. The humans didn't flinch. Frank simply adjusted his glasses and watched Vexar as one might watch a storm roll in, knowing it would pass, but respecting its power. "You brought elders to a summit of warriors?" Vexar boomed, his voice like grinding stone. "Do your young hide behind your bones, or are they all already dead?" Laughter erupted again, louder this time. A few delegates glanced at the humans with pity, others with boredom. To most, Earth was a footnote in galactic history, a planet that had barely crawled out of its own chaos a century ago. It had no grand fleet, no energy weapons that could crack moons, no empire to speak of, just stories of war, pollution, and near extinction. What could such a species possibly offer the galaxy? Frank didn't rise. He didn't shout. He waited until the laughter faded into uneasy silence. Then, in a voice that carried without effort, he said, "We came because we were invited. Not to boast, not to threaten, just to listen." His words were simple, but they cut through the noise like a clean blade. Vexar narrowed his eyes. He had expected groveling or bluster. Not this quiet steadiness. "Listen," the warlord sneered. "What is there to hear from a species that spent its youth tearing itself apart? You poisoned your own seas, burned your skies, and turned your cities into graveyards. And now you sit here wrapped in rags, pretending you belong among those who shape stars?" He stepped forward, his claws clicking against the floor. "The Karathi do not waste time on ghosts." Lena shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of her seat, but Frank placed a hand on her arm. A small gesture, but it said everything. "Wait. Trust. This is not our war today." Ray Monroe gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. The summit's overseer, a tall, feathered diplomat from the Lithari conquered, cleared her throat. "Warlord Vexar, the Accord recognizes all signatory species equally. Earth's delegation has as much right to be here as yours." Vexar turned his glare on her, but said nothing. He knew the rules. Even hunters must follow the trail laid by tradition. Still, his pride burned. He needed to put the humans in their place, not with violence, but with shame. So he raised his voice once more. "Then let them prove they are more than relics. Let them show us what they have built since crawling out of their own ashes. Or admit they are nothing but echoes." The chamber held its breath. Frank looked down at his cane, then back up at Vexar. There was no anger in his eyes, only something deeper, something that looked like sorrow but also resolve. "We'll speak when it's our turn," he said. "And when we do, you might learn something about what it means to survive." Vexar laughed again, but this time it sounded hollow, forced. The humans returned to silence, sitting like stones in a rushing river. Around them, conversations resumed, but glances kept drifting back to the three gray-clad figures. Who were they, really? Why had Earth sent only elders? And why did the old man seem so unafraid? Outside the chamber, through the curved transparisteel windows, the stars burned cold and distant. Frank Dobbs watched them for a long moment. He remembered nights on Earth when the sky was orange from wildfires, when sirens never stopped, when hope felt like a myth. He remembered the day the last war ended, not with a bang, but with a handshake between enemies who were too tired to hate anymore. That was humanity's secret, he thought. Not strength, not speed, not weapons, but the stubborn, foolish, beautiful will to keep going, even when everything said to stop. The summit would go on for days. Agreements would be made. Alliances would shift. But something had already changed in that room. The Karathi had laughed at the old human, but Frank Dobbs hadn't laughed back. He hadn't needed to, because the real answer wasn't in words. It was in what came next. And Frank knew, with the certainty of someone who had lived through the end of the world and helped build a new one, that the galaxy wasn't ready for what humanity truly was. Not yet. That night, the human quarters on Varel 9 were quiet. The room was small, just enough space for 3 cots, a table, and a single window that looked out into the endless dark. Frank sat by the window, his cane resting against the wall, his hands folded in his lap. Lena paced slowly near the door, arms crossed, her mind racing. Ray stood by the food dispenser, sipping warm broth from a plain cup, his eyes distant but alert. The laughter from the chamber still echoed in Lena's ears. She had spent years studying cosmic phenomena, mapping gravitational waves and decoding signals from dead stars. She believed in facts, in data, in things that could be measured. But today she had felt something she couldn't quantify. Shame. Not because of what the Karathi said, but because she hadn't known how to respond. She looked at her grandfather. "Why didn't you say more?" she asked, her voice low. Frank didn't turn right away. He watched a distant freighter glide past the station, its lights blinking like a heartbeat. "Because words mean nothing to hunters unless they're backed by proof," he said finally.
Vexar doesn't care about peace.
"He cares about power. And to him, peace looks like weakness." Ray set his cup down. "He's not wrong about our past," he said gently. "Earth did tear itself apart. We nearly wiped out every living thing just to win arguments no one remembers anymore." Lena frowned. "But we changed. We rebuilt. We stopped." "We did," Frank agreed. "But change isn't loud. It doesn't explode or roar. It grows quietly, like grass through cracked concrete, and hunters don't notice grass until it's too late." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small data chip, worn at the edges. "They want to see what we're made of? Fine, but they won't understand it unless they see the whole story, not just the ending." He inserted the chip into the room's projector. A soft hum filled the air, and then images appeared on the wall. Not of warships or weapons, but of ruins. A city half buried in sand, its skyscrapers leaning like tired giants. A child in a tattered coat planting a sapling in soil that still smelled of smoke. A group of people, old and young, different colors, different tongues, carrying water buckets up a broken hill to a dry village. "This is what came after," Frank said. "Not victory. Not glory, just work. Hard, slow, thankless work." The footage shifted. A scientist in a makeshift lab mixing chemicals by candlelight. A teacher drawing letters in the dirt for children who had never seen a book. A soldier, uniform torn, handing his last ration to a stranger's baby. No music played. No narrator spoke. Just silence and truth. Lena stared, her throat tight. She had read about the recovery era in school, but seeing it like this, raw, unpolished, real, was different. "I didn't know it was this bad," she whispered. "It was worse," Ray said. "But we didn't wait for saviors from the stars. We saved each other, one act at a time." Frank stood slowly, wincing as his knees protested. The Karathi think strength is about how much you can destroy. But real strength is how much you can carry, and still choose to build. He turned. Off the projector. The room fell dark again except for the starlight outside. "Tomorrow they'll hold the trial of legacy. Each species shows how they overcame their greatest trial. The Karathi will show hunts, battles, conquests, blood and fire. That's their story. And ours? Lena asked. Our story is quieter, Frank said. But it's deeper. Because we didn't just survive monsters from the outside. We survived the monsters inside us, Ray nodded. And we chose to become something else. Lena thought about her work, the equations, the stars, the search for life beyond Earth. She had always believed humanity's future was out there among the galaxies. But now she wondered if the real miracle wasn't out there at all. Maybe it was here, in the choice to keep going when everything said to give up. The next morning, the summit resumed. Tension hung thick in the air. Vexar sat taller than before, his tail twitching with impatience. When the overseer announced the trial of legacy, he rose without being called. The Karathi presentation was exactly as Frank predicted. Holograms filled the chamber. Massive beasts roaring on alien worlds, Karathi warriors leaping from cliffs with spears in hand, cities falling as their hunters claimed them in ritual combat. Vexar's voice boomed as he described each victory. We do not fear death, he declared. We master it. We shape it. We become greater through the hunt. The chamber erupted in applause. Even species that feared the Karathi nodded in respect. Strength was universal. Power was understood. One by one, other delegations shared their trials. The Lithari spoke of escaping a dying sun by weaving living ships from forest canopies. The Zenth showed how they survived a machine uprising by learning to feel again. Each story was grand, dramatic, full of clear heroes and villains. Then it was humanity's turn. Frank walked to the center of the floor, slow but steady. He didn't use the podium. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, and with a nod to Lena, the projector activated. The first image was of a bombed-out hospital. Rain fell on shattered windows. A woman in a blood-stained coat carried 2 children, one her own, one not, through the rubble. No sound, just rain and footsteps. Then came a clip from the last World War, not of soldiers firing, but of 2 enemy generals meeting in a ruined church. They didn't shake hands. They just sat in silence for an hour, then walked out together. The war ended 3 days later. Next, a global broadcast from Earth's Unity Day, the first year after the wars. People from every nation, every faith, every background standing in city squares holding candles, no speeches, just light in the dark. The final image was simple, a hand placing a seed into soil. Then another hand joining it. Then another. Dozens of hands, all different, all working the same earth. The chamber was utterly silent. Even Vexar sat still, his usual smirk gone. Some delegates wiped their eyes. Others stared at the floor as if ashamed. Frank finally spoke. You hunt to prove you're strong, he said, his voice calm but firm. We survived because we learned to stop hunting each other. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. He turned and walked back to his seat, the soft tap of his cane the only sound in the room. Vexar stood abruptly. His scales rippled with anger, or maybe something else. This is not strength, he snapped. This is surrender. You let your enemies live. You forgive those who hurt you. That is not the way of warriors. Frank looked up at him. Maybe not, but it's the way of survivors. The overseer stepped in before the tension could snap. The trial is complete. All stories have been heard. But everyone knew the real test hadn't ended. Vexar wouldn't let this go. His pride was wounded, and wounded hunters were the most dangerous kind. Later that evening, as the humans returned to their quarters, a message arrived. It was sealed with the Karathi crest. Frank opened it alone. The words were short and sharp. If your way is so great, prove it under fire. We will test your colony on Haven 7. Defend it without violence or admit you are nothing. Lena read it over his shoulder and gasped. They're going to attack. Ray's face darkened. Not an attack. A challenge. If we fight back with weapons, we lose our claim. If we don't defend it, we lose our standing. Frank folded the message slowly. Then we show them what defense really means. He looked at Lena. Do you remember Project Stillwater? Her eyes widened. The non-lethal grid. It's only been tested in simulations. It's time for the real test, Frank said. Call Haven 7, tell them to activate Protocol Green. Lena hesitated. Grandpa, what if it fails? Frank placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we fail together. But if it works, they'll learn something the galaxy forgot. You don't have to kill to win. Outside, the stars watched in silence. Somewhere far away on a quiet colony world, lights flickered to life in empty fields. Not weapons, not shields, just tools designed not to destroy but to protect. And for the first time in a long time, Frank Dobbs smiled, not because he was sure of victory, but because humanity finally had a chance to show what it truly was. Not warriors, not victims. Survivors who chose to build, even when the universe said to burn. The message from Varel 9 reached Haven 7 3 hours before the Karathi fleet dropped out of warp. The colony was small, just under 2,000 souls living in domes built from recycled ship hulls and local stone. Greenhouses ringed the settlement, fed by underground aquifers and solar mirrors that tracked the pale sun. There were no soldiers, no missile silos, no war machines, just farmers, teachers, medics, and engineers who believed in quiet lives under open skies. When the alert came, Mayor Eli Ruiz gathered the people in the central dome. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with kind eyes and hands calloused from years of tilling soil. He read Frank Dobbs' orders aloud, his voice steady despite the fear in his gut. Protocol Green is active, he said. No weapons, no aggression, just the grid. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded, others clenched their fists. A young woman named Mara, who ran the hydroponics bay, stepped forward. They're coming to hurt us, she said. And we're supposed to just stand there? We're not standing there, Eli replied. We're activating the defenses Frank designed. They don't kill. They confuse, they calm, they protect, Mara frowned. Will it work? Eli looked out the dome window at the empty sky. We'll find out. Across the colony, teams moved quickly but calmly. Panels slid open in the ground, revealing emitters no larger than dinner plates. Drones, small, silent, and shaped like dragonflies, rose from storage bays and hovered just above the tree line. In the command hub, a retired Earth engineer named Carl Briggs tapped commands into a console, his fingers flying over keys worn smooth by years of practice. Resonance field online, he muttered. Atmospheric modulators charged. Holographic projectors standing by. Back on Varel 9, Frank watched the live feed from Haven 7 on a small screen in his quarters. Lena stood beside him, arms crossed, her breath shallow. Ray sat nearby, eyes closed, as if praying in his own quiet way. They're coming, Lena whispered. On the screen, space rippled. Then, like shadows tearing through fabric, 6 Karathi warships emerged from warp. Sleek, black, and bristling with weapons, they hung in orbit like vultures over a wounded animal. Vexar's voice crackled over the open channel, meant for all to hear. Haven 7 Colony. You have 1 hour to surrender your defenses. If you resist with force, you will be erased. If you stand unarmed, you may live as proof of your weakness. Frank didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message had already been sent. We are ready. On the ground, Eli gave the final order. Activate. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then the air above the colony shimmered. A low hum filled the valley, not loud but deep, like the earth itself was breathing. The Karathi ships paused. On their bridges, warriors clutched their heads. Their neural implants, designed to enhance reflexes and aggression, suddenly buzzed with dissonant frequencies. The signal wasn't harmful, but it scrambled their focus, turning sharp instincts into fog. Report, Vexar growled. Our targeting systems are glitching, came the reply. Sensors show dozens of Haven 7s, all moving. That was the holographic grid. Using light refraction and terrain mapping, the colony now appeared as 50 identical copies spread across the region. Some in forests, some on hills, some even in the river. The real Haven 7 sat still, hidden in plain sight. Vexar snarled. Fire on all targets. Energy beams lanced down but struck empty fields, trees, rocks. No explosions, no screams, just wasted fire. Then the drones moved. Silent and swift, they released a fine mist into the upper atmosphere. It wasn't poison. It was a harmless aerosol laced with mild vestibular disruptors, designed not to harm but to confuse balance. Karathi drop pods launched anyway, warriors leaping out with claws bared. But as they hit the lower atmosphere, their inner ears spun. They tumbled, disoriented, landing hard in soft soil or shallow streams. None were hurt. All were stunned. On the ground, colonists watched from windows. No one ran. No one screamed. They just waited. Carl's voice came over the comms. Neural dampening at 78%. They're sluggish, confused, not fighting. Eli nodded. Good. Now the calm phase. From hidden speakers around the perimeter, soft tones began to play, low freak-out. ANSI sounds tuned to reduce aggression. Back on Earth, similar tones had been used in riot zones to lower heart rates and ease panic. Here they washed over the dazed Karathi like a cool breeze. One warrior, younger than the rest, sat up slowly, blinking. He looked around, not at enemies, but at green fields, at children watching from a distance, at a rabbit hopping past his foot. For the first time in his life, he felt no urge to hunt. On Varel 9, the summit chamber watched the live feed in stunned silence. Delegates leaned forward, eyes wide. The Karathi were being defeated not by fire, but by peace itself. Vexar roared in fury. Recall the strike team now, but it was too late. The damage wasn't to bodies, it was to belief. His warriors returned to their ship shaken not by pain, but by something worse, doubt. Back in the human quarters, Lena let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It worked. Frank nodded, but his eyes were sad. It worked because we built it to protect, not to punish. That's the difference. Ray opened his eyes. They'll hate us more for this. Maybe, Frank said. Or maybe one of them will wonder why we didn't kill them when we could have. Hours later, Vexar demanded an emergency session. He stood before the assembly, his scales dull, his posture stiff. This was trickery, he spat. Illusions and tricks are not strength. True power faces its enemy eye to eye. Frank rose slowly. We faced you, he said. We just chose not to make you our enemy. The overseer stepped in. The terms were clear. The humans defended their colony without violence. They have met the challenge. Murmurs of agreement rose from the chamber. Even species that had mocked Earth now looked at the humans with new eyes. Vexar's tail lashed once, then stilled. He turned and walked out, his warriors following in silence. That night, Frank stood by the window again. Lena joined him. Do you think it changed anything? She asked. Not everything, he said, but maybe enough. The galaxy thinks survival means being the strongest hunter, but we know better. Survival means choosing not to become the monster you fear. Far away on Haven 7, the colonists began cleaning up the empty drop pods. They didn't melt them down for weapons. They turned them into planters. By morning, seeds were already in the soil. And somewhere in the Karathi fleet, the young warrior who had seen the rabbit sat alone in his quarters, staring at his claws. For the first time, he wondered if there was another way to be strong. Frank didn't know that yet. But he hoped. Hope, after all, was the first tool humanity ever built, and the last one it would ever lose. The days after the Haven 7 incident passed in a strange quiet. On Varel 9, the usual buzz of trade talks and treaty debates slowed to a hush. Delegates who once ignored the humans now watched them from a distance, as if trying to solve a puzzle they hadn't known existed. Frank Dobbs felt their eyes but paid them no mind. He spent his mornings walking the station's inner ring, his cane tapping softly against the metal floor, his breath steady despite the thin air. Lena worked with the station's science wing, sharing Earth's non-lethal defense schematics, not as weapons, but as tools for peacekeeping. Ray met quietly with diplomats from smaller species, offering advice on conflict resolution drawn from Earth's long, painful lessons. But Vexar had not vanished. He remained aboard his flagship, the Iron Maw, docked at the far edge of the station's bay. He spoke to no one, accepted no calls. The Karathi delegation sat silent in their seats during sessions, their usual arrogance replaced by a stiff, unreadable stillness. Some thought the warlord was plotting revenge. Others believed he was simply ashamed. Frank suspected something else. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who realized the war they'd been fighting was built on a lie. Then, on the 5th morning, a message arrived. Not through official channels, not sealed with the Karathi crest, just a plain data packet, sent directly to Frank's personal terminal. Lena opened it with caution, expecting a threat. Instead, it held only 3 words. Meet me alone. The location was the observation spire, a narrow tower on the station's outer rim, used for stargazing and private reflection. Frank went without telling anyone. He took the lift up, the walls humming around him, his heart calm. When the doors opened, Vexar stood by the curved window, his massive frame silhouetted against the starfield. He didn't turn when Frank entered. You came, the warlord said, his voice lower than usual, rougher. I did, Frank replied, stopping a few paces away. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft whir of life support. Outside, a comet streaked past, its tail glowing faintly blue. Your colony, Vexar began slowly, did not fight, did not run, did not beg, and yet, we failed. He finally turned, his yellow eyes searching Frank's face. How? Frank leaned on his cane. Because you expected enemies. We offered neighbors. Vexar's claws flexed. That is not how the universe works. The strong take. The weak fall. That is law, is it? Frank asked gently. Or is it just what you were taught? The warlord looked away. My people have hunted for 10,000 cycles. We built our honor on the bones of the fallen. Without the hunt, what are we? That's for you to decide, Frank said, not me. But I'll tell you this. On Earth, we used to believe the same thing. That power meant control. That fear meant respect. We built empires that way, and every single one turned to dust. Vexar was quiet for a long time. Then, almost too soft to hear, he said, one of my warriors, the youngest in the strike team, asked me a question after Haven 7. He said if they could have hurt us but chose not to. Are they weaker or stronger? I had no answer. Frank nodded. That's the first step. What is? Wondering. Vexar exhaled, a sound like wind through stone. You say you are survivors. But survival without strength is just waiting to die. Survival with wisdom, Frank corrected, is choosing how to live. The warlord studied him, as if seeing him for the first time, not as an old man in gray clothes, but as something else. Something that didn't fit into his world of claws and conquest. Why show us this, he asked. Why not let us keep our pride? Because pride without truth is a cage, Frank said. And I've spent too much of my life in cages. Vexar turned back to the window. My people will not change overnight. The elders will call this weakness. The young will be confused. There will be unrest. I know, Frank said. And yet you did it anyway. Yes. The warlord was silent again. Then he reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a small object. A carved fang, black as obsidian, strung on a leather cord. He held it out. This is a hunter's token, given only to those who face death and do not blink. I offer it to you. Frank looked at the fang, then at Vexar's face. He saw no mockery there, only respect hard-won and heavy. He took the token. It was warm to the touch. Thank you, he said. Vexar gave a single nod. When I return home, I will tell them what I saw. Not just the tricks, but the choice. And maybe that will be enough. He turned to leave, then paused. You called yourself survivors, but I think you are something else. What's that? Teachers. And with that, he walked out, his steps quieter than before. Frank stayed at the window long after he was gone. He held the fang in his palm, feeling its weight. It wasn't a weapon. It was a beginning. Back in their quarters, Lena and Ray waited. They didn't ask where he'd been. They saw the token in his hand and understood. Did he threaten you? Lena asked. No, Frank said. He listened. Ray smiled faintly. That's rarer than victory. The next day, the summit resumed. Vexar did not speak much, but when the Karathi delegation voted on a new peacekeeping measure, one that included non-lethal intervention protocols, they did not oppose it. They abstained. To most, it meant nothing. But Frank knew better. Abstention was the first crack in a wall. As the session ended, a young delegate from a minor insectoid species approached Frank. My people are small, it said through a translator. We have no fleet, no weapons. We thought we had no voice. But your way, it gives us hope. Frank patted the creature's carapace gently. Hope isn't given. It's shared. That evening, the humans gathered one last time in their room. Their mission was nearly done. Earth's standing in the Accord was secure. But more than that, a seed had been planted. Lena looked at her grandfather. Do you think they'll remember us? Frank gazed out the window at the stars. Not me, not you. But what we stood for. Maybe. And that's enough. Outside, the Iron Maw detached from the station and drifted toward the stars. On its bridge, Vexar held a small data chip Lena had given him, filled not with weapons but with Earth's history of peace-building, farming, healing, and teaching. He would study it, not as a warrior, but as a student, and far below on a quiet colony world, children played near drop pods turned into gardens, their laughter rising like a promise into the clean, green air. The final day of the Galactic Accord Summit arrived with a quiet hum, like the calm after a storm that never broke. On Varel 9 the air felt different, lighter, as if the station itself had taken a deep breath and let it out slowly. Delegates moved with less hurry, spoke with less edge. Even the usual squabbles over trade routes and resource shares seemed smaller now, seen through the lens of what had happened at Haven 7 and in the observation spire. Frank Dobbs sat alone in the main chamber before the SES. Cyan began. He wore the same gray uniform, the same worn shoes, but around his neck hung the black fang Vexar had given him. It rested against his chest like a quiet secret. Lena and Ray waited near the entrance, giving him space. They knew this moment belonged to him, not as a leader, not as a hero, but as a witness. When the overseer called for closing remarks, species after species stood to speak. Most offered thanks, promises, or polite farewells. Then Vexar rose. The chamber stilled. All eyes turned to the Karathi warlord, his scales gleaming under the soft lights. His posture straight but no longer rigid with pride. "I came here believing strength was measured in kills," he said, his voice rough but clear. "I leave knowing it is measured in choices." He looked directly at Frank. "The humans showed us a path we did not know existed, not one of surrender but of wisdom. The Karathi will not forget this." He sat down. No roar, no boast. Just truth. Then the overseer turned to Earth's delegation. "Frank Dobbs, you have the floor." Frank stood slowly, leaning on his cane. He walked to the center, not with the stride of a warrior, but with the steady pace of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. He looked around at the faces, scales, feathers, shells, skin of every color, and saw not enemies, not judges, but fellow travelers on a long, uncertain road. "You asked what we are," he began, his voice carrying without effort. "You saw our past, our wars, our mistakes, our pain. You saw our present, our quiet work, our strange ways, our refusal to meet violence with more violence. And now you wonder what we call ourselves." He paused. The silence was complete. "You may be hunters," he said, and the words landed like stones in still water. "But we're survivors," he didn't shout. He didn't need to. The words were simple, but they held the weight of 1,000 years of struggle, loss, and stubborn hope. In that moment, every species in the room understood. Survivors weren't the ones who won the most battles. They were the ones who kept going after everything said to stop. Who chose to plant seeds in ash, who offered water to a stranger's child, who built peace not because it was easy, but because it was right. A soft murmur rose, not of laughter this time, but of awe. Some delegates bowed their heads. Others wiped their eyes. Even the Karathi warriors sat still, their claws resting open on their knees. The overseer stood. "By the will of this assembly, Earth's status in the Galactic Accord is not only confirmed, it is elevated. From this day forward, humanity will serve as advisors on post-conflict recovery, non-lethal defense, and interspecies reconciliation." Frank nodded. "We accept. Not as rulers, not as teachers, but as partners." The session ended soon after. As the humans prepared to leave, delegates lined the corridor, not to mock but to thank. A Lethari elder pressed a feather into Lena's hand. A Zenth engineer showed Ray schematics for a shared research project. And from the Karathi ship a small package arrived. Inside, a seedling from a Karathi world wrapped in soft moss. A gift, a beginning. The journey back to Earth took weeks. Frank spent most of it on the observation deck of their shuttle, watching stars blur past. Lena joined him often, bringing tea and quiet company. Ray read old Earth poetry aloud, his voice soft against the hum of the engines. When they finally entered Earth's orbit, the blue-green curve of the planet filled the window. Clouds swirled over oceans that had once choked on plastic. Cities glowed with clean energy, their lights gentle against the night. Forests stretched where deserts had been. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was alive. And it was trying. They landed in a small field near Frank's home, a modest house with a porch, a garden, and a tire swing still hanging from an old oak tree. Neighbors came out to greet them, not with fanfare, but with smiles and warm hands. No parades. No speeches. Just home. The next morning, Frank rose early. He put on old work clothes, filled a watering can, and walked to his garden. Tomato plants climbed wooden stakes. Bees buzzed around sunflowers. He knelt slowly, ignoring the ache in his knees, and began to weed. Lena found him there an hour later. She didn't say anything. She just picked up a trowel and started helping. "Do you think they'll remember?" she asked after a while. Frank wiped his brow. Not my name. Not yours. But what we stood for? Maybe. And that's enough. News feeds across the galaxy replayed his words. You may be hunters, but we're survivors. On a dozen worlds, young beings asked their elders what it meant to survive without killing. On Haven 7, children played near the old drop pods, now overflowing with flowers. And on a distant Karathi training ground, a young warrior placed his spear in the dirt and asked to learn farming instead. Back on Earth, Frank stood, stretched his back, and looked at the sky. The sun was warm. The air smelled of soil and rain. Somewhere a bird sang he wasn't a hero. He wasn't a legend. He was just an old man who had lived long enough to see his people choose better, and in that simple truth there was more power than any weapon could hold. The galaxy kept turning. War still flickered in far corners. Fear still whispered in dark places. But now there was another voice, a quiet one, steady and kind, that said, you don't have to burn the world to save yourself. You can plant a seed instead. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.